What is fashion? This is one of those questions that seems obvious but gets more complicated the more you get into it. It's a bit of an umbrella term that can describe a lot of things, though primarily people use it to describe whatever is trendy right now or was fashionable at some point in history. However, for this video we want to talk about fashion as a form of art, a medium that people use to express themselves on a daily basis. Because regardless of what you're wearing right now, it still represents who you are to some extent. While they can't pick out their own outfits, the same applies to video game characters. If anything, it applies to an even greater extent, since their clothing often has to express not only the character, but also fit into the general spirit of the game. With that in mind, today we want to look at the fashion choices in some of the major fighting games, and see if we can learn something about them by carefully considering their stylistic preferences and figuring out what do those things say about the game itself. If you end up enjoying the video, please consider subscribing or leaving a like. Thank you. We have a list of games that we want to go over, but before we do that, let's get one very common element out of the way, so that when we actually get to those games we can focus on more interesting nuances. Regardless of major stylistic differences, many fighting games use clothing as a visual shorthand for character personality or origins. For example, think of pretty much any character that's meant to be Native American. Despite the variety of styles, they will all share common elements that are meant to communicate their ethnicity. Stuff like feathers, war paint, head and armbands with traditional patterns, some sort of tassels, and often some sort of jewelry. It's so overt that you can't really miss it. The general logic applies to so many different character archetypes where a certain type of clothing is almost inseparable from their identity. Stuff like wrestlers, martial artists, the dandy/gentleman type, or the Ojo-sama. This is an obvious byproduct of fighting games having very little time to hook you, so characters need to be easy to understand at a glance. This way you instinctively know who they are and potentially even how they will play. There is a lot to inspect and compare in this regard as well, but for this video let's try to find more unique traits of each series. Unless this sort of commitment to visual archetypes is one of the game's strongest points. As for the order, there is no simple way to assign categories to these games. But we have 5 titles to look at, and we can generally sort them on a spectrum from realism to more exaggerated anime-style games. With that in mind, Tekken will be the first game we'll be taking a look at. It's fairly well known at this point that when Tekken was just starting out, their goal was to invent outrageous or unique characters that would stand out from their contemporaries, and especially the direct competition in the form of Virtua Fighter. I think one of the best ways to see this difference is to look at how Tekken handles the simplest, most generic martial artist concept. The original game has at least 3 of those, sort of. We have Kazuya, Bull, and Heihachi. Ignoring their alternative costumes, their hair, or things like tattoos and scars, there are still some unique things about specifically their clothing. Kazuya's red studded gloves inspired by JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, Bull's ripped sleeves that emphasize his beefy arms, or Heihachi's prominent tiger design on his back. You can really tell that they wanted the cast of the game to stand out. Even with the wrestlers, instead of designs that would be inspired by the immensely popular American pro wrestling, they were inspired by Lucha Libre, which arguably features much more extravagant and expressive outfits. Another interesting aspect of this era of Tekken is the presence of alternative outfits. Tekken was one of the first fighting games to adopt this feature, likely inspired by the hidden costumes in Virtua Fighter 2. Many of these outfits had the freedom to emphasize personal features of the characters, like King's training fit, Jin's biking outfit, or Heihachi's sick business suit. However, what makes them interesting isn't what they represent about the characters, but Tekken's overarching tendency to flex the graphical fidelity. This was one of the defining features even in the PS1 days, and can be traced throughout the series. Like with that famous Tekken 6 promo that wanted to show off how detailed Tekken is by showing you half-naked, sweaty Jin. But it is with Tekken 7 and 8 that this direction really crept up in the design process. Harada always seemed to be a bit of a tech enthusiast and seems to consider himself a proud PC player with a beefier rig. So this seems to be reflected in the desire to show people really intricate and detailed characters with extravagant outfits. For example, just look at King. This is where we started, and this is where we are. There is so much going on with this outfit that you would never, not in a million years, notice all of it during actual gameplay. It's obvious that many of these outfits were crafted with technology in mind. Even if you might not notice, they will put in the highly detailed textures, they will throw in lots of little physics-enabled elements, and keep piling on bells and whistles until they can ensure that Tekken characters appear to be more intricate than the competition.
Man, must be nice to be rich.
Some attribute all those details to the realistic art style. After all, there is a lot that goes into real-life clothing, especially with the more complicated pieces. However, we have another game here that very much adheres to the realism, visually speaking, yet follows a completely different philosophy. In a way, Mortal Kombat was already one of the most realistic-looking fighting games back when it released. After all, it doesn't get much more real than digitizing real actors. Back then, pretty much the entire style of the series, from MK1 to MK4, was defined by one of its founding fathers, John Tobias. Before becoming a developer, John was briefly a comic book artist. And as a fan of the medium, some of the design sensibilities make their way into the game. This mainly shines through in the overall simplicity of what the characters wear. If you look at many older comic books, they tend to lack the detail that you would find in modern publications. They were still made by the exceptionally talented artists, but they had to work within the limitations of the printing technology, which struggled with finer details and colors. While things would improve rather quickly, this era of comics would introduce countless iconic designs that used simple shapes and colors. That's why many of the classic MK characters tend to wear such comparatively plain clothes, and usually have one key color to highlight the important parts of the design. The colorful cast of ninjas is probably the best example of this. And as you know, MK likes to stick to the classics, so even after all these years, they have more or less maintained this idea of crafting simple yet striking costumes that would look at home in a comic book or in a crossover with a comic book publisher.
You should have finished him.
Your world must be different than ours. Here we don't kill our friends.
Now that we've looked at two games that strive for realism yet showcase drastically different styles, let's turn to something more exaggerated. We mentioned at the start that many fighting games use clothing as a visual shorthand to define who the character is and what they're all about. Well, with Street Fighter, it's hard to really pinpoint any other underlying principle, like the technological progress of Tekken or the love of old school comic books and action movies in Mortal Kombat. With that in mind, you could say that they took this approach to character design to its logical extreme, or that they arguably perfected it. I think the best games to show this are Street Fighter 3, 4, to some extent 5, and the Alpha series. The reason for this is that there was a noticeable art style shift after SF2, with characters getting more exaggerated proportions. Much like with real life, what sort of clothing will actually complement and highlight your features heavily depends on what sort of body you have, from your height and weight to your facial features and bone structure. However, unlike in real life, game designers are not limited by the shackles of the flesh. They have full and complete control over each pixel and every single polygon. With the Street Fighter series, this led to a fusion where the character's body and their clothing, down to every minuscule detail, are created with the purpose of expressing as much of their identity as possible. Where are they from, how do they fight, what sort of person they are? There is so much information packed into what characters choose to wear. For example, let's take a look at Chun-Li. The modified kipao represents her Chinese origins. Its blue color is a great fit for her tranquil and disciplined personality, with golden accents giving it a more dignified appearance. The spiked bracelets are deliberately bulky and heavy looking, communicating to you that she's a seriously experienced martial artist, while also balancing the top half of a bottom-heavy character, which is also helped by the puffy sleeves. Her legs have long been Chun-Li's signature, so this part is kept rather simple, highlighted only by the stocking that sets it apart from the rest of her body. By not having excessive detail on her legs, it allows you to really take in the sheer volume of leg muscle that she's working with. And of course, with kicks being a major part of her arsenal, the big wide boots help to silhouette a lot of her attacks, serving as a sort of tip of the spear, while also tying into her overall formal appearance, since she's also a police officer. And together with the white hair buns, the white sash that separates top and bottom, these shoes also help to balance out the color of her default outfit, creating an iconic design that continues to hold up decades later. This is partially why these designs almost always go unchanged from game to game. It's hard to iterate on elements that were meant to perfectly fit each other, which is why the new set of default costumes for SF6 was a somewhat polarizing yet deliberate decision, since Capcom wanted to find a way to really emphasize that the time has passed, and all of these characters are now at a different place in their life.
You win!
Now, what about Capcom's, well, I guess you could call them a competitor. I know we have a fair few SNK fans in the audience, so correct me if I'm wrong, but I always felt like what really puts SNK designs apart from pretty much every other fighting game is the incredible fashion sense. They obviously still have some designs that are very similar to Street Fighter in terms of approach. For example, with Geese you have a big blonde guy who's obviously not Japanese, yet he wears a hakama, throws out a bit of Japanese with American accent, and made his tower look like a Japanese castle on the inside. Everything about him tells you that he would probably get really mad if you called them cartoons instead of anime. And the slicked back hair is also a good visual nod to him being a crime boss. Aside from designs like that, SNK gave us dozens, if not hundreds at this point, of outfits that feel like they are more focused on looking really stylish and attractive, rather than simply telling you who the character is. I think it really comes through in the fact that much of the clothing you see in the games is typically not far off from something that you could wear in daily life, as long as you have the confidence in pulling it off, and confidence is something that none of these characters lack. You could argue that this makes the designs worse because they don't convey as much about the character, but I think it's more important to look at what they gain. By giving characters clothing that is more believable and practical, what they lose in information, they gain in authenticity. After all, if you're an electrician, you're not gonna be wearing a tool belt with you at all times. It's so much easier to look at these characters as actual people when what they wear feels like a real outfit they picked out, rather than some sort of cosplay or Halloween costume. In a way, it also makes their characters look unique, specifically because they are allowed to simply look great without having to obey the archetypes or stereotypes. Without this approach, we would probably never get Kei, Yamazaki, or Yori. And yet, those are some of the coolest designs in not just fighting games, but video games period. Another aspect of this I find interesting is that in a genre that is often criticized for overly sexualized female characters, SNK was sort of ahead of the curve and has a lot of male characters that are not necessarily sexualized but appear desirable, precisely because they use clothing to accentuate their features. One thing that people forget is that making a character look hot is not just about showing more skin or giving male characters jiggling genitals. It's about putting accents on things that men and/or women find attractive. Someone like Benimaru is a great example of this. His costumes are often skin-tight and pretty revealing, but what do they reveal? They specifically show off things that people like, the abs and the toned arms with well-defined shoulders. Aforementioned Kei is also showing off the great V-cut, and when Rugal is not wearing his incredibly sleek suit, he's showing off his shoulders and traps with the black skin-tight top that has a cheeky little mesh gap. In a way, this sort of down-to-earth approach to fashion is also reflected in the way SNK treats their narrative. Not everyone is out saving the world, some of them are just people dealing with their personal problems. And especially in the later games you get nice, lengthy story mode epilogues that tell you what they've been up to. It helps to make the worlds of SNK feel more alive, and we commend them for it.
Is that really him?
Listen to me, boy. Live free, as a wolf should.
For the last one, let's just go full anime. It's hard to pick a good representative in here because there is so much range in character outfits when stylization is cranked up to 11. But for now, let's go with the leading anime fighter in Guilty Gear. The most interesting thing about fashion in Guilty Gear is not so much the clothes themselves, but how they were affected by different goals and the passage of time, with the most dramatic shift occurring in Strive. Funnily enough, Daisuke himself said he doesn't really care about fashion. When the series just started out, he was mainly influenced by all the anime and manga he was a fan of. Among them, the heavy metal fantasy manga Bastard was one of the biggest influences, which you can really see in many of the early character designs. From the wild hair to somewhat plain clothes that are accented with various plates and armor pieces. Even the setting itself, being somewhat of a dark fantasy with a metal aesthetic, is very much in line with that inspiration. You could almost say that the whole thing is a love letter to media he grew up with. This didn't change all that much when the series made the biggest graphical leap with the release of Xrd. All the character designs did get updated, with some changes being more drastic than the others, but it felt more like Daisuke finding his own voice and further amending those original influences with his own artistic sensibilities. And then comes Guilty Gear Strive. When making the game, the developers mentioned in some of the interviews that with this game specifically, live-action movies were one of the biggest influences when it came to visuals and storytelling. It sort of makes sense for a title that wanted to appeal to players that existed beyond the hardcore group of Guilty Gear and fighting game fans in general. And it seems like this had a massive influence on all the character redesigns. Just look at someone like Kai. He always had these crazy elaborate outfits. They look great, but they also look like a costume that you put on to play some sort of role. Even if we can understand that within the universe, it could be his daily attire. Now here comes Strive, and he sheds all those layers for an almost minimalist fit, with color matching pants, open button-up shirt, and a simple white jacket hanging off his shoulders. Though there are little touches that make it more interesting, with the crosses on his pants, a few belts and straps, and the nice balance of his blue gloves with the blue lining of his shirt. It's such a casual, relaxed, daily fit. And this is true for pretty much every returning character. Everyone who used to have a fairly complicated outfit has swapped it for something more believable, grounded, and very modern. You could very much imagine someone wearing this sort of clothing out on the street, especially in Japan, where daily fashion trends often combine practicality with a strong sense of self-expression. It's telling that even despite its over-the-top identity, when Guilty Gear had a clothing collab, it was to promote fashionable casual clothing. And who knows, maybe if there is a next Guilty Gear, we might see another major shift in style depending on what the game wants to achieve. This turned out to be longer than expected, and yet there is still so much to talk about regarding both small and big details in how fighting games approach specifically the clothing aspect of character design. But hopefully we'll revisit that again at some point. For now, we want to hear what you think about the fashion choices in fighting games. What games left the biggest impression on you with regards to character outfits? And what kind of approach do you personally find to be the most appealing one? As always, massive thanks to everyone who watched all the way through. We deeply appreciate you, and we'll see you next time.